Welcome back, Ways and Weeboos, to the Television Doge, where today I'm finally covering a little bit more some of the maps that I've been making in BTD6 while I've been gone. Because I only made that initial video on the map editor when it first came out, and in fairness, I haven't made all too much since. Obviously, for a large chunk of this period, I haven't been anywhere as into balloons as I have been in the past. And as I already covered in my Mermonkey video, this most recent update has really sparked a lot of excitement back to the game for me. However, to be quite honest, while I am going to cover the two other maps I've made since, I'm mostly going to focus the majority of this video on the third map, Jungle Temple. But that being said, I will very quickly cover the other two maps that I've been working on. First up, Deadly Diversion, a map that I mostly just made to kind of test out the new sort of removables and interactables that have been added to the level editor. And just all the other new features, like I didn't even realize that we got speed changes, which I decided to take advantage of with this map. Essentially, I already had been working on another map I was going to make for Christmas a while ago, which was supposed to be the whole gimmick was like there was a naughty lane and a nice lane, you know, who's naughty or nice, and like the naughty lane is like extremely short and dangerous, and the nice lane's really easy to defend. And so like, you know, you got to defend both of them, but you don't have to spend that much money on one of the lanes because they're so out of the way, and the other one is much more difficult to defend. However, I kept just feeling like I couldn't get the layout of the map right. It kept feeling annoying to play, and it kept feeling like it was difficult to fit towers in the space that was available on the map. But the only way that I could do that was to kind of destroy the way that it looked. And so eventually I decided I was going to throw this away and try again. And so Deadly Diversion, even though it was a very different map, decided to still take that sort of idea of having two lanes, but one is clearly easier to defend than the other. Now, you might have thought from first glance the easier to defend lane would be the one with the loop, but actually that is the harder to defend one, because I also decided to take advantage of the speed boosts on this map. The initial intention was for the loop to be the easier one and the straight line lane to be the harder one, and I was planning on making the straight line lane extremely short. But once I realized that I could speed up the balloons, I thought it might be more interesting to make the loop lane the harder one, because the balloons go at hyper speed through the loop, which makes them extremely difficult to hit, and makes it so that the top right lane is actually very short technically because of how quickly the balloons traverse it. Meanwhile, the bottom left lane not only is longer, but also the balloons move slower on it, giving you more time to deal with them. This map also took advantage of the new system where you could move the balloons to different lanes as the match progresses, and so I made it so that there was a pattern that repeated every 9 rounds. Every first 4 of those rounds, it would come from one lane, then the next 4 the other, and every 9th round, it would come from both at once. The reason why I picked 9 rounds specifically is I was mostly interested in how I could make this the wackiest I possibly could for DDT rounds. And making sure this always happened on rounds that were multiples of 9 made it so that both the first DDTs on round 90 and the wave of fortified DDTs on round 99 would both come from both lanes simultaneously, maximizing the difficulty. This map had 3 different interactables that would all destroy things in the way or even build new things in those locations, including this very fitting lifeguard chair asset, which is the one position on the whole map where you can see literally everything, which by the way is why this interactable is the most expensive one to build. Which brings us to the second map I've made since, Gridlock, which I admit was a bit of a gimmick. And while I still think it was worth making, I think in the end this idea didn't really pan out. Essentially the idea was, I thought it would make for a really cool expert map to make a map where the whole gimmick is the track is nothing more than a straight line from left to right, but the reason it's supposed to be so difficult is because of the fact that the entire track, every last crack of it, is completely covered by fences that act like line of sight blockers. Meaning that with normal towers, there is literally no way to attack the track. If you're wondering how such a map could even be possible, that's obviously because of effects that can shoot through walls, such as guided magic wizards, or even just basically every flying tower in the game gets to go over walls and such like that. And initially the thought was this would make for a really difficult map. The main thing I had to figure out, though, was obviously how to make round 6 possible on CHIMPS, because you'd have much more limited options. In fact, going in, I thought the only option you would have would be a guided magic wizard, which of course would force you to have to make the first round really easy. As it turns out, you don't quite have to stoop that low, because I didn't know until making this map, but beast handlers can actually poke through solid objects with their sticks if they're unupgraded. So that's how I ended up beating the first few rounds of this map on CHIMPS. Not to mention, I also completely forgot that for whatever backwards ass reason, beast handlers when unupgraded apparently cannot pop purple balloons with sticks. Don't ask questions. Either way, when I made this map, I thought it was going to be extremely difficult, but as it turns out, it kind of unfortunately ended up being a bit too easy. And a lot of that was probably because of the fact that to make the early rounds possible, I had to make the balloon speed on this track slower. I kept trying to test play it and try targeting micro and things like that, but no matter what I did, I just couldn't make the first round possible without massively slowing down the balloon speed on the track. And that's a shame because once you do get started on this track, then it kind of becomes too easy. Unfortunately, there's just kind of too many options that are too good. Spike factories are 100% effective on this map. As I mentioned, any flying tower will work perfectly fine. And because of just how much time you get to deal with the balloons on this map, none of it is really a challenge. Which was not what I was hoping for. Honestly, I would have found a way to fix this before finishing off the map and uploading it. If it weren't for the fact there's only one thing I could think of, and I feel like it would kind of mess with the visual style of the map, that being that I could maybe see me making like a system where I create a lane that's supposed to be just for the first couple rounds, that is like really easy to defend, but then the main lane you gotta worry about is still gonna be like the last few rounds of the game is still gonna come from there, and that lane's actually a problem. That might work, but the problem then would be the best I could do would be to make it so that every round ending in 6, the balloons come from there, but you're not allowed to have the pattern go longer than every 10 rounds. So the best I could do is just make a lane that, you know, round 6, 16, 26, etc. comes from. Which I guess might work, but it just would feel weird, you know? It feels a lot nicer to just have it be the one lane. I still think I got this map looking pretty good, but unfortunately, the playing, it's just a little bit easier than I anticipated. But either way, that brings us to the main attraction, Jungle Temple. After Gridlock didn't really pan out the way that I'd hoped it would, I kind of took a step back to sort of reassess how I want to go about making maps. Not that I wasn't putting time and effort into the maps I was making, but certainly when I started making these maps, when the map editor first came out, I was in a much more rapid fire, just mess with stuff and see what you can do kind of mindset. Which made sense, it was a brand new feature that I was still learning. And so I made 8 maps within the span of like 2 days. However, I kind of realized that while I wasn't exactly spamming maps like I was doing in the past, I was falling into a little bit of a trap of valuing quantity over quality. And again, that was fine when I was starting out and still figuring out how the map editor worked, but obviously now it didn't really make sense. I was kind of at the point where I should probably be slowing down now that I do know how it works, and really just trying to focus on one real good idea. And funnily enough, the map that was probably the strongest inspiration for Jungle Temple is probably not what you're thinking, because it's not a map that's very outwardly similar to it. But that map would be Twisted Nightmare. Some of you might have already heard of it, because it's quite infamous. Essentially, there is a map list for this game, as in a list of all the hardest maps that have been proven possible in CHIMPS mode by a human being. If you're thinking this sounds a little bit like the Geometry Dash Demon list, well, that's basically what it is, but for balloons, because literally the guys who made it took direct inspiration from the Demon list from Geometry Dash. But either way, Twisted Nightmare is probably the most infamous level on the list. Funnily enough, not because it's the hardest. It's the 6th hardest last I heard, but probably because out of the hardest maps, it's arguably the single most visually appealing and impressive, while still being one of the hardest. And the reason I say this map is an inspiration, even though on first glance there are like no similarities, is more because of a vague reaction that I got out of this map. I remember when I first saw it, it blew my mind and I couldn't even imagine how what I was seeing was physically possible in the map editor. But then it only took me about a minute to realize that actually, this map was pretty simple, at least in concept. In terms of effort, it obviously would have taken a hell of a lot to still construct all the things that we were seeing on screen, but in terms of the tricks they'd actually employed to get it to work, it actually seemed to be quite simple. Probably the most striking thing on the map was, of course, the skull stomped into the ground in the center of the map, especially because obviously that's not an asset that you can use in the level editor. But all it is on closer inspection is a massive pile of rock assets that have been copy-pasted, shrunk, rotated, and moved around to look from a distance like a skull. Pretty clever. Obviously very tedious, very impressive still, but pretty simple honestly. And so that kind of gave me inspiration, the fact that it was such a simple effect, and yet it was so mind-blowing to see at first. Now, still, you might be thinking, well, where's the one-to-one here? Because in fairness, when I thought I would take the same principle and put it into use in my own levels, it didn't really pan out exactly how I'd imagined. But still, I think it came out good. For me though, the way that this principle was employed was with the temple itself. For those of you who hadn't noticed yet, the temple in the back is not a pre-made asset. Like, you can check the prop section in the level editor, there is no temple prop. The entire thing is completely built out of smaller assets combined together. So my initial plan was to do it the exact same way it had been done in Twisted Nightmare, to make the entire temple out of much smaller rock props that had been completely resized, rotated, and put into the right perspectives to look from a distance like a completely new asset. Unfortunately, I very quickly realized that wasn't really going to work, because although there were plenty of rock assets to choose from, almost all of them have a very, very flat color palette. They have like one color with not much shading in it, just because that's the art style of BTD6. And the reason why that's a problem is because if this is supposed to be like an old abandoned jungle temple, it doesn't really look right for all the bricks making it up to look shiny, pristine, and new. Not to mention, the colour I wanted to go for was more of a sort of faded greeny yellow colour for the rocks, and there are no rocks assets in the game you can use of that colour. And so I quickly hit a little bit of a dead end where I wasn't really sure how I was going to make this work. Eventually though, I bit the bullet and just thought, okay, I'm just going to build it and see how it looks. And considering that rocks don't really look all that great, how about I try and find a better asset? And eventually, after looking long enough, I found a slanted roof asset which you could rotate to a certain perspective to make it look like grey bricks. It still had that whole it looks too clean problem, but I was going to work with it and see where it went. Combined with other urban assets for the floor and some clever layering and perspective tricks, eventually, after a long while, I had the temple built. But I must admit, I kind of had a moment where I'm like, do I need to start over? Because at first, when the temple was just built and nothing more of the level was done, and the temple was just like a pile of bricks essentially, it didn't really look very good, especially considering I spent hours putting it together. But I could tell that the main problem with it was just the fact that the bricks didn't look like they had any texture to them, you know? There weren't any cracks, there weren't any shading, and I couldn't go and add that in myself. I just needed to find some way to make it look more overgrown or something like that. I don't know where I got this, but in my head I could have sworn there was sort of like a subtle moss asset I could have used, which is what I was planning on layering on top of it, but I think I was thinking of a stamp, and unfortunately the way the stamp system works in the BTD6 level editor, stamps can never go on a layer above props, so there'd be no way I could put the moss stamp on top of the already existing bricks. But I had one last idea up my sleeve just before I gave up, which I had to see if it worked at the very least. That being taking these sort of jungle branch assets and constantly rotating and resizing them to make it look like overgrowth going over the bricks. I was honestly a little skeptical that it would work very well, but I had to try it. And don't get me wrong, it took forever to layer all these over the bricks, especially because all of these branches you're looking at right now might look flat, but the asset itself is not flat. And on top of being not flat, it rotates on basically all three 3D axes. When you also combine that with the fact that there are already perspective tricks going on here to make things look like they're on top of each other when they kind of aren't, and also take into account the fact that basically any of these branches, if slightly rotated the wrong way, would be clearly visibly clipping through aspects of the level's geometry. Yeah, it was a pain getting all this down, but it was worth it in the end, because once it was down, I was finally starting to see it come together. Even now with the finished version, I still am a little bit frustrated. I couldn't find any way to shade these bricks, again, because the usual way I shade things in the level editor is using a stamp. I've already mentioned how stamps don't work on props. But either way, I certainly was pretty happy with how it came out in the end. Though even once I'd built the temple, it still didn't quite look right to me. And that's because initially when I was dreaming this up in my head, I was hoping I could do a bit of an almost side-on angle. You know how most BTD6 maps are top-down? Well, I was hoping to be able to have this map be a map where there's sort of a sky section on the top half of the screen and a ground section on the bottom half. And essentially the only way that you can place any towers near the top half is to place them on the temple, because of the fact that you obviously can't place towers in the sky. Unfortunately though, as I finished building up the temple, I kept seeing that, yeah, there wouldn't really be a way to make that perspective work, and so I did stick with just the normal top-down perspective for the most part. But because I was doing that now, I really didn't know what to put to the left and right of the temple, and it kind of looked wrong just having flat ground with nothing there to the left and right of it. But at this point, the track layout was already planned out, and I really didn't want you to be able to place towers in those sections. I kind of just wanted them to be areas of the map in which you can't place anything, but then it looked wrong to just have nothing there. Also, while building it, I know this just makes sense, but even still, it constantly felt like it just looked like an object in the middle of nowhere that kind of didn't make sense a lot of the time. And even as I kept populating the screen with more jungle assets and bushes and branches, it still looked like it was too much just kind of out in the open and a bit out of place. But eventually I remembered that I could take these sort of bush assets and use them almost like tree leaves and layer them right on the top of the screen, so it almost looks like an overlay that sort of covers the corners of the screen, not only taking up the parts of the map that felt the most empty, but also making the whole map feel a bit more hidden away because it's surrounded on all sides of the screen by these sort of branches. And yeah, this might be a little bit hard to get across if you haven't seen it yourself, but this map looked completely bare without this sort of border around the edge, and with it, it looks so much better. Eventually, all that was left was towards the end I realized I didn't place any interactables in the map. And while I suppose I had no obligation to, at the same time, it didn't feel that great to me to make a map like this and not make any interactables. And for a bit I was worried that there'd be nowhere I could cram them in, but eventually I had the idea to add these sort of logs on the top left and right sides of the screen. These are in fact removables, and once you remove the logs, underneath are tree platforms for towers that they can be placed on with a decent amount of space, probably not enough for a village plus other towers, but for a relatively large tower like a heli you could probably fit it on there. And these spots are the only spots on the entire map where you can see everything. The log on the left costs 6,000 to remove and the log on the right costs 10,000. The reason why the one on the left is cheaper is one, even when I have two of the same removable, I do like to have one be cheaper than the other a lot of the time. But on top of that, the reason why the left one is the cheaper one is because it is the worst position. The top lane has a bias towards the right side of the screen where it spends more time there and less time on the left. So the left position is less valuable, so it shouldn't cost as much. Now, if you're thinking 6,000 and 10,000 is a little bit steep, you might be right. I'm not gonna lie, when I made this map, I was kind of thinking to myself that a lot of the official maps honestly make removables too cheap, if anything. Which kind of makes sense because it's really hard to set them at the right price because of the way that cash just scales so crazy in the late game. But yeah, while paying 500 to remove a removable from the track is basically never worth it in the first 5 or 10 rounds or so of the game, when you get to the last 10 rounds and that thing's still in the way and causing a huge problem, paying 500 to get rid of it is literally nothing. And when you also take into account that this would be a much bigger advantage, getting essentially a god spot on a map where there aren't that many good positions, I thought it made sense to set the price pretty high. I genuinely believed you'd still probably want to use it when beating the map because having such a good spot would be that valuable. But yeah, I definitely overestimated how high the prices had to be cranked. Especially because I did find that money was very tight on this CHIMPS run. So in hindsight, if I could go back, I would probably change these prices to 2,000 and 3,000. Unfortunately though, you can't edit a map once you've already uploaded it, and to be honest, I kind of just forgot about this when I was actually just playing the map, and so I didn't really think about the fact I should probably make them cheaper until after I'd already uploaded it. So yeah, unfortunately in the actual CHIMPS run, I do not ever buy these logs. Either way, that's how I went around building the visuals for this map. With all that said, let's get over to the actual layout of the map in terms of how it plays. Because the tracks are a bit wacky here. I know that you've been watching the footage for a little moment, but just to explain in case it hadn't been clear enough. For the vast majority of the rounds, the balloons come from the bottom of the screen, either the left or the right. For rounds 1, 2, and 3, they come from the right. 4, 5, and 6, they come from the left. And 7, 8, and 9, they come from both at once. With either of these two more normal lanes, they essentially make their way up the temple by either going up the little stairs on the right or going through the portals. Which portals are linked to which positions is indicated by the object above the portal. If two objects are the same above a portal, it means the two portals are linked and both lead to each other, with the only exception being the final portals, which have these sort of warning signs on them, basically just to indicate, hey, these are the exits, this is where the balloons leak. So yeah, essentially they only have to climb up to the second sort of section of the pyramid to be able to exit. But you might notice that that only covers rounds 1 to 9. What about round 10? Well, every 10th round comes from the top lane, the last portal that is left unmarked. And this lane is quite a doozy. In fact, little fun fact, this lane actually starts at the bottom of the screen technically, but the balloons are just invisible and invincible until they appear from the portal at the top. The whole reason this is done is because this lane is so short that if the lane did just begin at the top, it actually doesn't allow me to keep it because the lane is too short. There is a limit to how short you can make a lane in the level editor. So yeah, you do not have a lot of space to work with on this lane, as it literally just moves to the right, and then moves up, and then leaves. This makes it, I believe, the second shortest lane in the entire game if we're only counting this and official maps. I think the only lane in the game that might be shorter than this is the lane in Erosion on round 100. And I think the second shortest after that would of course be Workshop. Then again, I suppose maybe I should count Blondes, so maybe Blondes gets thrown in there somewhere. Either way, you get the point. This is a very, very short lane. Again, I think it's slightly shorter than Workshop is probably the best comparison. But more importantly, this lane is all the way at the top of the screen when all the other lanes are down at the bottom, meaning it is very hard to defend both this lane and the lanes below. Now, of course, you only got to worry about this lane 1 in every 10 rounds, but by the same token, that just further incentivizes you to not put defense up there, only making it harder when balloons do start appearing from there. This presents a very interesting and unique challenge, and I'm honestly kind of disappointed we don't have more official maps that take advantage of mechanics like this. You might also notice making that lane every 10th round really maximizes the danger because of how many of the dangerous rounds in the game are one of the 10th rounds. The first Moab is going to come on 40, the first BFB on 60, the first SOMG on 80, the first DDT is on 90, and of course, most importantly, the BAD on 100. All coming from that top lane. But then again, any non-global range defense will struggle to attack there and attack the other lanes. So it becomes this sort of dilemma of trying to figure out ways that you can defend the lanes on the bottom with the slightly more forgiving layouts, but doing it with as little money spent as possible so that you still have money left over to defend the top lane. And this leads to a lot of wacky shit happening. I mean, I won't get into the full details, but I actually really enjoyed how this map ended up playing, because an example of the kind of wacky strats you'd have to employ just to get by, this is something I never do on a normal CHIMPS run, but you might notice, I believe this far in the footage, you probably have seen me place a corrosive glue gunner on the left. This is a 200 glue gunner, and it's not turning into anything later. It's just a 200 glue gunner that's there. And you might be thinking, why on earth did I get a 200 glue gunner just there with no plan for it? Well, that's because I really tried, and I genuinely don't think, at least with the strategy I was employing, there was any way in the entire game to beat round 20 without placing this glue gunner. Because of the fact that corrosive glue is so effective against black balloons, because of the fact that they're slower than pinks, which means that obviously you can glue them more easily because they're easier targets, and on top of that, because of glue soak, it will deal with all the insides. I really tried to see if I could get a more reusable tower to tackle this round, or if maybe there was a more cost-efficient way to do it, but no, corrosive glue was the only way. I mean, hell, even this boomerang in the center, I want to turn it into a glaive lord at some point, so I would want a 502. Yes, the 520 has better total DPS, but it can't pop lead, and I'm worried about DDTs. So I would want the 502. The problem with that, though, is that you actually need to get a 110 boomerang to even beat round 10. So I'm locked into the 520 cross path, which again might have more damage, but it can't pop lead, and I don't have space for an MIB, and I also can't alk buff it because the spinning glaives eat the alk buff almost immediately. So there's just a lot of points on this map where you have to make extra considerations and readapt your strategy over maybe towers and cross paths you didn't necessarily want to place, but you literally had to just to beat the early rounds like the 10, 20, and 30 rounds. Not to mention, obviously it goes without saying, but round 40 is quite the choke early on. I honestly don't even know how you'd go about beating this map with any other hero except Corvus or maybe Psy. Overall though, while usually I don't like maps where the early game is really annoying and challenging, I actually like it here because I don't think it's annoying. Maybe this is just creator bias, but I feel like this is a different kind of early game difficulty, where it's less, oh, the position placement of the towers is so finicky and awkward, oh, this is so frustrating, I don't know what to do. It's a lot more, you can't really put something down and be good, you know? You put something down and it'll deal with the round you're on right now, but it will only be like 1 or 2 rounds before you need to put more down. But you also don't want to fall into the trap of wasting way too much money early game on early game defense that won't translate to the late game, because the late game in this map is still really difficult. I guess I'd say that usually I really hate when the early game of a map feels really difficult, because a lot of the times it's like because of micro difficulty, you know? It's kind of like, oh, I have to do targeting micro, I have to switch the hands of the boomerangs, I have to make sure that it's on a pixel perfect placement. That's not very fun. But here it's not really that makes it challenging. Here it's much more that you get your defense, and instead of it being, okay, there's my defense for the next 20 rounds, it's more like, okay, this will literally keep me safe for 2 rounds, and then I'm gonna need to buy more, and then I'm gonna need to buy more, and then I'm gonna need to buy more. But I always, at every opportunity, have to keep thinking, okay, how do I do that while wasting the least amount of money possible? I'm trying to remember, but I'm pretty sure it gets so close to the wire that the earliest I figured out that I could place Corvus without dying was round 30. Much later than you would usually be placing your hero. But just genuinely, I kept trying, and I believe the only other round I found that you could place Corvus was mid-round 19, in which case you just die on round 20 immediately afterwards. I will say though with the layout, there was one thing that really caught me off guard. That being where my boomerang is right now is kind of the best spot on the entire map. Now don't get me wrong, I already was aware that that spot was probably going to be pretty good. I mean, there's a reason I instantly knew I wanted to put my boomerang there. But initially, I thought this spot would be the most valuable spot you could get, at least for a non-infinite range tower that wouldn't cost money like the god spots where the logs were. And I mean, that's technically true, but I really didn't think it would be very ideal. Because don't get me wrong, you can see a large chunk of the most dangerous track, while also being able to see both exits of the other 2 tracks from this position. But the problem is quite obvious. You can only see the very exits. And so I thought that a tower in this position would, yes, be able to help catch leaks from the bottom path, but you just wouldn't be able to make it defend well enough, considering how little range it had to both exits, to make it a really powerful spot. However, I'm still underestimating the Glaive Lord, I guess, and how broken it is after so many buffs, because the Glaive Lord here absolutely hard carried, and it was effectively a god spot. It may as well have been. In fairness, again, a lot of this comes down to the tower, and a lot of this probably just comes down to how strong the Glaive Lord really is. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about line of sight blockers on this map, because in fairness, they're mostly pretty interesting, but there's a couple issues. So I will say this about the map editor. I am pretty happy with how it is now, especially now Interactables have been added, as well as a couple things I never even thought we were going to get or ask for, like the balloon speed changes, like the invincibility on certain lanes at certain times, like the shrinking and growing. But if there are 3 things I still want for the map editor, there's 2 small ones and 1 very big one. The first small one is something I already mentioned in the first video. I know it might sound strangely specific, but you might be able to guess by the theming of this map, but I really think we have a severe lack of temple assets in the game. And I know that might sound strange, but I'm talking about things like, imagine what you see in shoots, for example. I feel like that kind of stuff would work really well for the level editor, because it's visually pleasing, but it's also something that makes sense to be in a blocky design, but still feels like it fits in BTD6's aesthetic. Unfortunately, we have basically nothing when it comes to temple aesthetics. The best we have is we have the statue from Rake, I guess. So I definitely want more assets like that available in the game. The second thing is, I do think it's a bit strange we've gotten so many specific tools for, you know, changing how balloons behave on lanes and switching lanes, and yet we haven't gotten a Moab-only lane yet, when that was a feature that was added to the game a long time ago. But I'm also not losing sleep over it. But the third one is the big one. And this is one of those things that's simple in concept, but I realize it'd be very difficult in execution. But that being said, I genuinely think it'd be one of the best things you could add to the level editor. We need better controls for making maps with different heights to them. I don't like that every map that you're encouraged to make in the map editor is flat. Like, you can make non-flat maps, and I really try to do that, and obviously I made a non-flat map here, but they really make it as hard as physically possible for you to make a map in the level editor that isn't flat. For those of you unaware, there is only one way you can raise a tower above its normal position, and that would be using a platform object in the map editor. Okay then, so get a platform object right, should be pretty simple, shouldn't it? Well, go take a look and you'll see the options you have. There's a crate, there's a rock, and there's a bunch of pools of water, but they don't even usually increase your height for the most part, they're mostly just to put water on a land area. And those are your options. You can have water, rock, or crate. Those are all of your options for anything you want in the entire game to try and make your tower actually a higher position. Can you see why I think that's quite disappointing? If you want to have a higher platform anywhere in your entire map at any point, and your map doesn't want to use rocks or crates, then you just can't do it. Not unless you employ even further trickery like I had to here. In this map, I use crates to increase the heights of towers. Only these crates have to be non-visible because they look ugly and out of place in this map. And so I have to engineer this extremely specifically so that hidden under the bricks of the temple are tiny fences that act as line of sight blockers, but then on top of that, underneath that, there are further crates that are high enough to go over the fences so that you can see over them, but also low enough to go under the bricks and under the branches and under all the effects and under the track and etc. You can see how this might be a headache to put together. And the worst part is, after I did all this, I can't figure out how, because I've done this in other maps that I've been working on in the map editor. I literally have a map in the map editor right now where I've been able to get around this. But for whatever reason, on this map specifically, no matter what I did, they refuse to see over the fences even though they're standing on a crate that is taller than the fences, and the fences were shrunk down and moved as low down into the ground as possible without just making them below the ground. And for whatever reason, the towers just refused to see over the fence. So eventually I admit I kind of got a bit frustrated and just said whatever, I'm going to go with it. As a result, that spot at the top middle, while it's pretty close to a god spot, can't actually see below the temple because it can't see past the fences. It can only see on the temple everywhere. This is unfortunate, but at the very least it did make the map more challenging, and I do appreciate that. But yeah, I certainly wish I could have fixed this. Another thing that's kind of frustrating, though this one truly was unfixable, was because of the way this works, because the crates have to go under the props to make them actually placeable, but that's also where your towers go. The models of the towers, so that you can actually see where they're placed, are going to go under your decorations. In other words, there may actually be towers right now on that top middle platform as you're watching right now, you just can't see them because they're underneath the bricks of the temple, because that's where the platform they're standing on is. Yeah, that's also not exactly ideal, but there's literally nothing I can do for that because of the fact that we have so few options for higher platforms in this game. I don't know, I just feel like maps that actually have height to them and depth really look way better and play way better. It makes them so much more interesting almost immediately. And I feel like it's a lot harder to make flat maps engaging and exciting and look really cool. So I just think it's a massive missed opportunity to have just no options when it comes to higher platforms in the map editor. Now, when it came to actually beating the map, I already talked a little bit about the strategy, but I didn't want to get all too into it. For the most part, it's pretty standard. Glaive Lord's just broken, and so I used it. I end up getting a 400 aircraft carrier, which is very unconventional, but it's just that the Moab missiles are so valuable, and because this map is so tough, it's actually literally just being bought because it's really good for dealing with Moabs and BFBs in the sort of 40 to 60 to 80 rounds. Usually you just kind of get a carry tower that gets through so many rounds before you really need to spend money again, but though you can get powerful towers like that on this map, you can't get them in spots where they can see everywhere. So having a global range Moab missile firing tower is very valuable. But you don't really need any cross-pathing, so you don't cross-path it. You don't waste any money you don't need to spend. You just want the Moab missiles, so you just get a 400. Very unusual, but it did seem to be very worthwhile. Corvus also puts in insane amounts of work in this run, as expected. But other than that, there is defense at the top of the screen that you can't see, including a village, an alchemist, a bouncing bullet, and a main Moab sniper that will eventually become a cripple Moab. I was constantly entertaining the idea of maybe fitting in a final harmonic here somewhere instead of a cripple Moab to be the sort of bad defense, you know, the whole final harmonic Glaive Lord combo, but in the end, it didn't really work out. So we go with the cripple Moab. Now, I'm not sure if I already would have passed this point at the moment, but there is a point where the gameplay switches over. That's because it took me a total of 3 different runs to beat this map, and I was still constantly figuring it out as I was playing. And the footage that you started watching at the beginning of the video was the 3rd run, and I did beat it on the 3rd run. That being said, I took a break right towards the end of that run to do some sandbox testing to see how I would do against round 100. I could only compare to Workshop, but that was pretty close to the kind of map length I'd have. I also took a bit of a break before finishing off the last couple rounds, and then I came back later. And of course, when I came back later to finish off the last couple of rounds, I forgot to resume recording, which means I didn't catch the last 2 rounds on camera. And that just won't do now, will it? So the footage you're probably seeing right now will be of my 4th run, and that's essentially me just beating it again, but this time making sure to get the end on camera. I would usually be pretty frustrated about having to do this all again, especially because it's not an easy map, but at the end of the day, obviously since I made it, you know, I'm enjoying playing it, and on top of that, I also didn't mind redoing it because the run that I had going was very scuffed, and I feel like the second run through was a bit more clean. But yeah, as it turns out, the bad is such a threat on this map that you basically need both a first strike and a cripple mob to deal with it, and you can't just cheap out and only get one. It might have been possible without a cripple mob if I made sure to keep all my Corvus mana on deck so that I could do some kind of Echo Overload combo to deal with the bed or its insides. That might have worked, but either way, round 99 is enough of a threat that you usually have to expend quite a bit of mana and spells to deal with it, no matter how well prepared you think you are for it. One last thing I will note is you might notice late in the game I get these beast handlers upgraded to Golden Eagle. That's essentially just because, well, these things are broken, man, at least on the right maps, and this is certainly a spot where they're pretty good. Because of the fact that the exit of the bottom 2 lanes is so close to the beginning of the top lane, you can just take any bloom that's about, just literally any second now about to exit from the bottom 2 lanes and just slap it onto the 3rd lane and leave it plenty of track to travel through, as well as the fact that that allows towers at the top of the screen that wouldn't be able to shoot anything otherwise to have clear line of sight to balloons because they're now on the 3rd track as well. These 2 eagle spots are just too good to pass up, especially considering, as you might have noticed, this map is very tense. You're basically encouraged, because of how good these spots are, to leave the balloons all the way to the exit and then finish them off right just before they exit. So obviously, having something that takes balloons so close to the exit away from it is very valuable in a defense like this. Either way, I was pretty happy with how this map turned out. If you were hoping to give it a go, then I will warn you, it's not easy. Obviously, I'm playing it on CHIMPS, and that's where it was verified, so that's the recommended game mode, but if you wanted to give yourself a bit of an easier time, you could obviously play on an easier difficulty. But here is the code for the map if you wanted to give it a go yourself, and hopefully I'll remember to leave a pinned comment with the code and a link as well. With that being said, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.